Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. The reason we put this webinar on, which I'm sure many of you know, is because of the resurgence of allegations and evidence of mistreatment of women and men in Westminster. And we've got three experts with experience and extensive knowledge around the climate of working in Westminster to talk to us today. And I'm afraid I have to send apologies from Hardy. She is feeling unwell and not able to join us. And the way we're going to organise this session is that we're going to hear from each of our three panellists in turn, and they're going to give us a brief synopsis of the main issues that they think are pertinent to this question. And then we're going to come back and I'm going to ask them a few questions. And then we're going to have questions from you, the audience. So if you could use the Q&A function, please, everybody, and put your questions in there, and then I'll be able to put them to our panelists. And we're going to start with Sarah Childs, who is my good friend and an expert on gender and sensitive parliaments, the author of the Good Parliament report, and Professor of Politics and Gender at Edinburgh University. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much. And as the panelists know, I've just gone down with COVID, but I think I'm compos mentis, so hopefully I'll be able to answer kind of Rosie's questions. So when I think about why I sort of started studying sexism and the underrepresentation of women in British politics, it sort of started back in the 1990s when I just didn't think there were enough women there, and I was sort of driven by a sense of injustice. And so my research sort of started by counting the numbers of women. Then I sort of looked at what difference did the influx of Labour women make to our politics and to our parliament. And in the last sort of decade, moving much more into trying to transform parties, but from particularly 2015 onwards to transforming the British House of Commons into an institution that's gender sensitive, and also to think about it being diversity sensitive. So in a sense, I introduced, I invited myself in. I sort of banged on the door and said, I want to come in. I think, and this was slightly arrogant, but based on lots of international scholarship and other domestic scholarship, I just thought, I know what the problem is. I think I know what the answer's in, but I need to know the institution better. Let me in and I'll be able to transform it. And of course, it's never been as easy as that. Institutional change, bringing about feminist institutional change, is oftentimes resisted. One of the things that Rosie asked us to reflect on was our own kind of personal experiences. And I think this is probably the first time I've actually said this publicly, but myself, I was subject to that hand on the knee by a politician. I contacted a politician I wanted to speak to about information. He said, come and meet me. I can talk to you about candidate selection. I go to a hotel bar and the classic leg rubbing happens. And like many other women, I did nothing about it, but later found out that I wasn't the only academic to whom this had happened. And of course, this is just another of those micro occasions where women put up with behaviour that when they would hear it about other people, they wouldn't necessarily accept it, but you're in a position where you don't want to seem rude, you're trying to establish and maintain relationships, so you carry on. Obviously, I moved away from him on the sofa, but nonetheless, personal experience of the very gentlest, that hand on the knee, but we often know that the hand on the knee is just the beginning of behaviours. So I should say that the Good Parliament report, which was the report that came out of my self-invitation to the House of Commons in 2015, 2016, did not look at the experiences of staff, and I think that is quite obviously a limitation. So I did hear some stories, but I tried to address the issue of the experiences of women, sexual harassment, bullying, and wider behaviour in its first recommendation, which is was to create a new concord about what constitutes unacceptable behaviour, unprofessional behaviour. But I think, and perhaps this is something for questions, it was much more a symbolic rather than a substantive ask. Right, I realised just how difficult it was to police MPs' behaviour. And I think that lies in exceptionalism, which I'm sure Hannah's going to talk about. And I think that's linked to electoral mandates, cultures of deference, and the idea of not seeing Parliament as a workplace. So when I think, and I'll bring this to a close now, Rosie, that when I think about the current situation, I'm really concerned we're actually witnessing a backlash, that maybe what we're seeing is a response to the greater presence of women in our institutions. We often talk about an upward trajectory. Things will get better, we'll get more women in, things will be better, there'll be a critical mass, politics will change. The original people who wrote on that idea warned us of backlash. And for me, I'm very concerned about the lack of institutional leadership, both symbolic and substantive, that responses are often piecemeal, ad hoc, rather than taking a really systematic and systemic and coherent response to the problem. We need to have, as we did between 2016 and 2018, an institutional body that takes women's concerns within Parliament seriously. And for me, there's plenty of material out there about what needs to happen. There's lots of gender sensitive parliaments, checklists, guidelines, recommendations, standards. But the Speaker, I think, needs to reconsider the formation of a group that leads on this agenda. We also need a third parents in Parliament survey. We need to know more of the experiences, and we need the institutions and processes and accountability mechanisms to deliver on them. That's me, Rosie.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and articulate as ever despite COVID. And now we're going to move on to our next panelist, Hannah White. Hannah is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Government and author of the sadly very timely book, Held in Contempt, What's Wrong with the House of Commons. And she received an OBE in 2020 for services to the Constitution. Hannah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rosie. And I'm going to, I think, just in my opening comments, also reflect on the question Rosie asked us to think about, which is our sort of our own way into this issue. And the bit that Sarah didn't talk about so much, which is the staff side, because my early career was spent working in the House of Commons as a House of Commons clerk. And when sort of the Pestminster scandal, as it was dubbed, broke in sort of 2017, I had left the House of Commons by then via a stint working on the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which gave me ample opportunity to reflect on these sorts of issues. But I was working at the Institute for Government, and a lot of the press coverage focused on the sort of highest profile examples of sexual harassment in Westminster. And we saw, for example, Michael Fallon have to resign as a result of that. And I just had this real sense of uncomfortableness, lack of comfort, because I felt, well, yes, you know, there are these very high profile, extremely unacceptable behaviours, but the thing that I was conscious of was the low level systemic culture of bullying facilitated by unequal power relations within Westminster, which, you know, obviously, you know, serious instances of sexual harassment have a massive effect on those individuals. But I felt that this sort of culture of bullying, which went on with complete impunity, was determinative of the lived experience of everyone in Westminster, not just the few who were unfortunate enough to be subject to really egregious behaviour. And so I really made strenuous efforts to get that onto the agenda, and that was something that is obviously not just a gendered issue, but when the sort of press coverage of bullying by MPs reached sufficient sort of level that something had to be done about it, the Cox report that was commissioned ended up having 200 people. The Cox report was to look at the experience of House of Commons staff members very specifically. 200 people contacted that inquiry, and 68% of them were women. So there clearly was a gendered aspect to this issue. And you know, I think that the problem for House of Commons staff specifically is that they are largely supposed to be invisible. A lot of people thinking about how the House of Commons works would not even think that there is a sort of a set of people whose job it is to make the chamber work, to make committees work, to provide all those services. They think MPs just sort of turn up and do their thing, and there's, you know, they magically have all this information and know what to do. And so that invisibility, I think, is very disempowering. Although House of Commons staff, in comparison to MP staff, do have at least the advantage that they have an HR sort of service to go to, and that maybe is something that we can come on to, because it's another issue that's come up more recently. But as Sarah was saying, I feel that the cultural problem is very much this issue of deference to members by staff, that essentially it's always up to members to decide in the end, that politics is the thing that overrides everything, and that staff of the House don't take enough responsibility for challenging members. They feel it's inappropriate to challenge them on matters to do with politics, and that can bleed over towards not calling out inappropriate behaviours. And I think that the other thing that I felt really came out of the Cox report and is symptomatic of a problem is this idea that resilience is a key attribute of working in the House of Commons. But if you can demonstrate that you are resilient, which is code for willing to put up with stuff, then you will get on. And that is just highlights the problem there. So I think, you know, since Pestminster, we've had these various inquiries, we've had a lot of work on process. And as Sarah highlights, sort of having process around these things, I think, is really important. We've had the development of the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, which is a fantastically inappropriately named scheme, which is not about any of those things, which has produced some good outcomes. But my reflection, I'd be really interested in Sonia's thoughts on this, is that putting in place all this process has been relatively good for staff, because it's helped them have a sort of a locus from which to challenge behaviour. I think potentially it's been less useful for elected members of the House. Having this ICGS, having the independent expert panel and so on, doesn't necessarily, without the culture change that we all agree needs to come with the process, hasn't necessarily made it easier for women or other people who are you know, experiencing harassment, bullying, to challenge, because politics is fundamentally tribal. It's about relationships. Whether you get that job in the cabinet or the shadow cabinet isn't about whether you can evidence, you know, your skills. It's about your relationships with people. And if you are the person who's caused trouble by calling something out, then you know, no process is going to help you with that. So I think, you know, we've had a mixed picture. We've had some process change, but the things we haven't really had are any sort of tone from the top in terms of what matters. As Sarah said, an absence of parliamentary leadership on this, both from the Speaker's side, although he has recently started to talk about, you know, this idea of a Speaker's committee on looking at an HR function for staff, but really an absence of leadership either on the political side or internally to drive that culture change. Infrequent calling out of bad behaviour, and also challenge of processes. And I think it's interesting, the idea that Sarah introduced of backlash, people subject to the processes that have been put in place, questioning the legitimacy of those processes. So I think we need process change. We also do need to continue fundamentally making our parliament more diverse, because it's when the people who are there are the ones who are making the rules about how we do politics. Unless you have a more diverse set of people inputting into those decisions, you're never going to get anywhere. So that's obviously the big picture challenge.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's so insightful. And we're now going to move on to our final panelist, Sonia. Sonia Khan is Associate Director at Cicero Amu, previously Special Advisor to two Chancellors, Safed Javid and Philip Hammond, and served as a campaign manager at number 10 Downing Street during David Cameron's time in office. Over to you, Sonia. Thank you so much.
No problem. And thanks for having me today, Rosie. It's such a fascinating topic to talk about. I'll keep my remarks short, because you've heard from much better and much more insightful speakers. But I wanted to use my time to focus on just very personal reflections from my lived experience in politics, and particularly Westminster politics. I should probably put my cards on the table and say politics just runs through my veins. I got started in local politics when I was 17. I met my husband through politics at the same age. I've had various roles in the civil service and party politics, both as a press officer and then a special advisor. My colleagues are all political nerds. My friends are from the same sphere. So I guess I've really lived it and breathed it. I think the one thing that has been very consistent over the last 13 years, and I think it's to the point about what processes can we introduce, how much accountability can there be? But I think I've really found that much of the misogyny that we see in Westminster and in politics is based on the fact that society has very different standards that we hold men and women to. And ultimately it's that feeds a lot of the behaviour that we see, not just in Westminster, but across various sectors and careers. And I think that you can't really tackle Westminster in itself until you tackle that. And I think I sort of, when I put this together, there were two quite pervasive views I found, and I think they're both equally as harmful. But I think the first is probably one that's less spoken about, but this sense that women are very vulnerable and need kind of a hero to swoop them out of situations and be helped. And it might sound harmless, but it's where you often get a lot of mansplaining, but senior men cutting women out of stressful positions or roles because I think they're trying to be helpful. I saw this in the civil service a lot more. They might do it on the basis that she shouldn't do this project because she'll have childcare, or sometimes it's based on the perceived resilience of women, which is really frustrating. And then I think the other half are very focused on sort of keeping women in a box and feel threatened by any woman who becomes kind of too big because she challenges a man's place in society. And so you see a lot around kind of trying to remove the credibility of women, to reduce them to a pair of legs, like we saw with Angela Rayner this week, to prompt discussion about how they look rather than what their ideas are. And I think this group see the difference between men and women as like a real weapon. And sometimes it's hard to work out which one is more harmful, someone who is just very naive or someone who is a bit insecure. And I think despite all the strides that we've seen in politics recently, so from 2 female prime ministers to 1 political party having, I think it's over 15% of female MPs, I think little seems to change. And for me, that really comes from the fact that salacious stories about women are still much more likely to sell in the press than about men. Women are still likely to be victims of domestic violence or sexual assault or be upskirted. I think I've seen that actually some of these unsavory attitudes start really early on. So I'm technically about to have a baby in a few weeks, but the number of people who I know in politics, some of them not, who would describe themselves as really liberal and progressive, have passed comments about how it's a shame I'm not having a girl because girls are so much better behaved than boys, and they're much more likely to listen than boys. And I think that's part of the problem. We have a very narrow view of what a good woman looks like and a successful woman and the balance that is expected from a woman. And there's no real sort of universal concept of a good or a successful man. So men can have the freedom to raise a family or live their life without judgment. And I don't think until we resolve this through kind of better education or at home or through schooling, we can't really begin to undo that in Westminster. And I think that, I totally accept that Westminster has problems of its own with the treatment of junior staff, as has been highlighted, the blurred lines between staff, the endless late night drinking culture. But I feel very strongly that we could introduce all the measures in the world, whether it's a safe space, a greater focus on punishment, better leadership, reporting, accountability, but what none of those will resolve are just very basic and long-held attitudes towards women and women in the workplace, most of them that come from men. And I think that is the much, much bigger challenge. How do we as a society collectively kind of reshape what it means to be a woman at work and make sure everyone is part of that journey and not just women and some men?
Thank you so much, Sonia, for sharing those reflections with us. And all 3 of you have prompted me to think about, it's 10 years in October since Julia Gillard made her famous misogyny speech. And as part of that, she's putting together an edited book, Essays on Misogyny. And I wrote a chapter on misogyny in the workplace. And to be honest, most of our work at the Institute is about structural sexism, more of the kind, Sonia, when you were talking about the sort of implicit or perhaps paternalistic or at least not malicious kind, rather than the more overt, hostile kind of sexism. So it's quite a change for me to be focusing on misogyny, the real attempts to control and women. And one of the things I learned from doing that literature review is that in the studies of workplaces more generally, rather than Parliament, there's this concept of the iceberg, and that the micro behaviours that Hannah was describing, the everyday bullying, is the foundation that actually supports the very worst behaviour at the top. And so, you know, Hannah sort of described that very clearly. And I suppose, Sonia, you were talking about the problems in wider society, and certainly they're myriad. I think one of the issues about Parliament that both Sarah and Hannah and you all brought out is that it's quite a unique place of work in many ways. And that research I was looking at showed that actually a toxic climate where there's a lot of sex-based abuse, and that can be abuse against women, most often abuse against women, but sometimes abuse against men, is more common in very hierarchical organisations and those that are male dominated, especially at the top. And I sort of feel tick. But all three of you have talked about the problems and to some extent the solutions. But if there were one thing that you could really set in motion tomorrow, a change that was going to happen, what do you think might really help us start to make some progress? Because it's so depressing, you know, 5 years on from those first Pestminster stories, many years into previous allegations and findings around poor behaviour and abusive behaviour, we don't seem to be making the progress. What would you like to see? Perhaps I'll take you in reverse order. So Sonia, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see attitudes change at sort of a political level, because we hear a lot about whips or senior people in political parties who don't take action when they hear about kind of bad behavior that's ongoing. So I guess mine is behavioral, and create some sort of either incentive or mechanism that makes those people act on the sort of information that they're given, because they're all very, very senior. They're people who are in trusted roles. I don't quite know what that is, or whether motivational punishment is the right thing to do, but that's the change I would like to see, because I feel like those people drive the way that Westminster works.
Thank you. Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, I very much endorse what Sonia says. I feel that at the moment, one of the problems is that there is a sort of general narrative that sort of breaking rules doesn't matter, and that is quite insidious, because although, you know, politicians might be able to justify themselves in lots of different situations why a particular set of rules don't matter, if it adds up to a general picture of, you know, the people at the top don't, you know, are for various reasons not following rules, that makes it easier for people who are inclined to break rules to do that themselves, and makes it harder for more senior people to call them out on that, because if they're, you know, if that's their general attitude. So I think there's sort of that is something we are really missing at the moment, is that level of leadership. I mean, one of the things I've started to think about a lot, having written my book, which does have a whole sort of chapter on representation in Westminster, and I owe a debt of gratitude to Sarah, who provided me with loads of really interesting challenge and insight, which massively improved that chapter. And one of the really things that she prompted me to think about, which she's mentioned already, but is that trajectories in terms of representation at Westminster and increasing diversity are not set in stone, that they're going in one direction. And so the thing that you know, and there are examples internationally of parliaments getting less diverse. And so I think we can't let political parties off the hook in terms of continuing their efforts and actually working a lot harder in some cases to make their candidates for winnable seats more diverse, because first past the post means lots of safe seats. At least a third of seats haven't changed hands for decades. So who is selected in seats which are winnable is crucial to how diverse our parliament is, and that is the underpinning factor, I think, for actually challenging this culture and making a more diverse set of people feel comfortable with parliament as a workplace.
Thank you, Hannah. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I think I want to really stress that I think Parliament as an institution can make a difference. I think it can decide that it wants to get ahead of society. I think it can sign up to a certain standard of behaviour that is very different from the kind of behaviours that happen now. We can see around the world that lots of parliaments are undertaking audits and reform programmes to be gender sensitive parliaments. And I think our parliament needs to take ownership of that ambition, that goal, and bring politics and the administrative side together again with a very clear programme of action for the next 5 years, of which behaviour is a very significant part of it. But I think rather than think of it being a single solution, it's got to be an institution-wide recognition that it has a responsibility to practice a form of politics, a form of democracy, and as a workplace, be one where there isn't discrimination, bullying, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. And to do that, it needs to be systematic and comprehensive in its approach. And I realise I've said that twice now, but I think it really matters. I think with a commitment and resources and an ambition and being held to account by people outside, by academics, civil society, the media, Parliament would do a lot better. I very much agree with Hannah's concern that at the moment we have a leadership, a political leadership, that is less concerned with these issues, and we mustn't let the politicians and then the institution take its eye off this really important aspect of a gender equal democracy, because without that, the kind of politics we would get will not meet the needs of people in this country.
Thank you, Sarah. The first question in the chat relates to something that I was thinking on while you were, all three of you were raising your points. The first question is, how do we actually make a parliament and the people working there more diverse and inclusive, given it can be a very unwelcoming environment? Diverse people wouldn't necessarily feel included. And that was very much on my mind when you were talking about increasing diversity, and also particularly from an intersectional lens, thinking about, one way into a political career is often working for an MP, being a member of an MP staff. And if you are working for an MP from an ethnic minority, a woman MP or a woman MP from an ethnic minority, the mail, so to speak, that you're receiving can be so toxic that I wouldn't be at all surprised that puts people off. So what can we do to, it really shocks me. For a period of time, I reviewed the Fabian Women's Network's political education and mentoring scheme. And right at the beginning, the issues the participants used to raise were things like confidence raising. The last one I did was in 2016, just after the murder of Jo Cox. And the issue was all around safe spaces for women and how to deal with toxicity in social media. So I think, Hannah, your point that there's a danger of going backwards, and especially from an intersectional point of view, is real. And what can we do about it? Who would like to jump in? Sonia, have you got thoughts?
I mean, I guess I can start with the first part of that answer, not least because I've gone through that journey from someone who came from quite a non-traditional background into politics. I mean, I guess maybe the ultimate answer is representation, but the curious thing that I find about politics is sometimes when people succeed, they actually feel very, very uncomfortable about highlighting how that they are different and what challenges they face that are different to other people. So I feel like that's probably one issue, some sort of recognition that it's okay to have different pathways and actually to encourage multiple different pathways, as opposed to, I guess, just praise those who've come from a very political background or have come from kind of a fairly kind of traditional route into that role. But I think transparency was the biggest issue. I didn't really know what roles I was going into. I didn't really know who I was going to work with. And it probably would have been nice to have felt slightly more prepared and therefore, as a result, a bit more comfortable about what to experience. Like the example that you gave about mail, you're right. The first time you experience any racism, it's so shocking and so debilitating, and it makes you feel so uncomfortable and really question your place in the workplace and whatever else. But actually, I think if someone had prepared me for that, particularly when I was younger, I might have just recalibrated a little and say, okay, this is a very unpleasant part of the job, but my wider objective is to try and achieve change in some way. So I've got to accept it, or I've got to deal with it in this way. So I guess there are two parts of my answer to the first bit of the question about how do we make people feel much more comfortable.
It's really insightful and interesting to think that we should be providing kind of more support earlier on. I mean, it's so depressing that's the kind of support that's required, but I think that's a really, that's something that political parties need to be taking on board. Hannah, you look like you're ready to intervene.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something that Sarah was saying, and this is something I wrote about in my book, because I felt that there's the things I've been saying about the responsibility of political parties to make Parliament more diverse. But I think that MPs who have arrived in Westminster also have a real responsibility to think about how inclusive Parliament is as a workplace. And I think there's this dangerous constitutional principle that the cohort of MPs who make up Parliament at any given time, all the decisions about how Parliament runs and legislation that's passed are for that cohort. And that has to be the case. That's the democratic principle. But in terms of the way that Parliament itself actually runs as an institution, it is very problematic, because anyone who has made it as far as Westminster has made a whole series of compromises and said that they are willing to work in this environment, and has become aware of it, as Sonia's describing, through a journey over time, perhaps. But by the time you get there, you've decided that this is something you're willing to put up with. And all the people who, for whatever reason, are more diverse or have different requirements or different expectations and wouldn't be prepared to work in that environment, don't get as far as Parliament in order to have the opportunity to shape it. And I think we need to sort of start to chip away at this idea that Parliament is entirely owned by the current set of MPs. There needs to be more of a sense that Parliament belongs to the public and that it is a valuable institution, and that everything in Parliament shouldn't just be done for the convenience and in accordance with the preferences of current MPs, because actually, for the good of the country, it might be better, that there's a different set of people in Parliament. And as Sarah's said, in order to address the needs of the population, Parliament needs to be, there's a lot of evidence that a more descriptively representative Parliament would be more effective to represent the needs of a more diverse population. So I think, as I say, there needs to be more of a sense that MPs are the stewards of the institution, and absolutely they should make decisions, but that they should be a requirement for them to take into account the interests of Parliament and the country, and that Parliament belongs to everyone and not just to the people who happen to have just got themselves elected.
That's such a powerful point, Hannah. Thank you. Sarah, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, actually, from a staff point of view, and I think we can see, Parliaments aren't unchanging. There has been improvement in some areas. We have, for example, workplace equality networks within Parliament. Now, I think we can ask bigger questions of them. How well are they resourced? Is this extra voluntary work done by staff in addition to their other jobs? Are we making sure that these equality networks are meeting the needs and having a particular say in the kind of discussions that Hannah was alluding to about institutional change? And I think if we work from that bottom up on the staff side, we will be able to get a much better voice to actually challenge some of the preferences that Hannah talks about. You're absolutely right. MPs are temporary inhabitants of this permanent institution, and we need what's good for British democracy and the British Parliament, not just what happens to suit MPs. But I think on that staff side, we can really rethink the extent to which staff are supported in their everyday work to ensure that those who come with the non-traditional backgrounds, if you like, are not disadvantaged, are not felt, to be marginalised and looked over, and perhaps to be subject to the kind of discrimination and the microaggressions that we know operate in institutions. We can look at best practice elsewhere. I mean, we know that big institutions globally, have begun to do much better on equality and diversity and inclusion. So I don't think we should think that Parliament is an institution that cannot learn from other practices, even if they are not parliaments.
Thank you, Sarah. And we've got a comment rather than a question from Meg Munn, which I think feeds into some of the things that you've all been saying in terms of what suppresses willingness to raise issues. And she talks about the environment within the political party. And I certainly know that some of the news coverage around individuals who have faced sex-based harassment, feeling they can't make use of the grievance procedure because they fear that backlash that you were describing. But also Meg talks about not wanting to get media attention. So she says she didn't raise publicly a sexist comment made to her by a candidate for speaker because she just didn't want that spotlight shone on her. It's a particularly unique workplace in that regard, isn't it? And how to facilitate transparency around these issues when actually there's all these structures that actually make that less likely. Does anyone have any reflections on what Meg's said?
I was just going to say, Rosie, that I think it reflects back to what Sonia was saying earlier about sort of prevailing narratives about how women are, and I can see from the point of view of women MPs, they don't want to reinforce a sense that women are fragile and need support because they're raising an issue. They want the focus of media attention to be on the policy issues that they care about, the things they're trying to achieve for their constituents, and not to be in public because of these because of something that they've raised in terms of unacceptable behavior. So it is a really problematic thing, and it is also for many elected politicians are very driven, very motivated in politics because they want to achieve things and change things, and often improving the institution, which sort of facilitates all that, and reflecting on the adequacy of the institution is very low down their list. Understandably, that's not why they came into politics. They didn't come in to make Parliament better. Parliament is the vehicle, and we can all sit here and say the vehicle could be so much better, but they're really interested in its destination rather than what's under the bonnet.
Thank you. So we had a question from Tanya Manning, which I think in various places you've all answered some of it, but she talks about what have other institutions done that made a change, and I certainly know that in the research evidence about how can you kind of make healthier workplaces, there are a number of factors. One of them is role modeling from senior leadership, which Hannah, you've mentioned. If the attitude at the top is that you can break rules, and that can permeate through the whole organization. And the other one is actually in organizations that are very hierarchical, you're more likely to have these kind of toxic cultures than ones that are more project-based or more horizontal. And I think, again, that this is something Hannah and others have mentioned around the fact that this idea of deference to MPs, I think, is highly problematic. If you've got this idea that there are these high status individuals and everyone else is somehow lower status, rather than we're all making our contribution, that's really problematic. And of course, all three of you have talked about diversity and how diversity is such an important part of any solution. And then we've got two other questions about quotas, and I'm linking it in because if we want more diversity, we can wait, or we can do something about it that would make a difference at the next election. Now, obviously, the Labour Party has got more than 50% women MPs, but what are your views, all of you, about quotas for other parties and quotas around the representation of ethnic minorities? Sonia, have you got thoughts?
I do. I'm a bit naturally hesitant of quotas because I feel like there has become a real stigma attached to them in the UK, and anyone who has come through and succeeded through a system that has come through a quota, because they get known for having come through that quota. And I don't know if you remember, but years ago there were talks of like Blair's babes and Cameron's cuties, people who arguably have preferential treatment to get to where they are, and this kind of sense that actually the process wasn't meritocratic, when actually for any MP elected it's not a wholly meritocratic process, as Hannah points out. So really this should make no difference. So I question what impact that will actually have and how comfortable people who have gone through that route feel and being open about the benefits of this process. And I'm speaking from a very, very personal place. I don't feel that many people who go through a quota process feel particularly proud that they've done that, and therefore are likely to encourage, I guess, the systematic change that we want to see. And the risk is it could just become kind of a one-off measure to help introduce some women or some people from ethnic minorities into Westminster. I mean, I'll admit, I don't know what the actual answer to that one should be, but I mean, broadly, that's where my thinking is. And I wonder whether actually better routes are more apprenticeship schemes or internship schemes, or more partnerships with certain organizations. And actually we support people through like various parts of their careers, and it's not just about being in a representative role, it's about being in a role that's really valued in that institution as a whole. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear from Hannah and Sarah.
Thank you, Sonia. Hannah, your mic's off.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like us not to need quotas. And I totally see what Sonia's saying, but I kind of think that more than a century after it was possible for women to get elected, the fact that we haven't had as many female MPs elected as there are MPs sitting in the House of Commons at any given time is just such an obvious indicator of the fact that without some of these sorts of mechanisms like quotas, which, as the Labour Party has demonstrated, do work, our progress is just not fast enough. And I think that the benefit, you know, yes, there might be some downside for some of the people who come in that way. My observation about most politicians is, at the end of the day, getting to where they want to be is the most important thing, because then they can make the change they want to change. So I think a lot of politicians would make that trade-off if, you know, they're prepared to stand in an all-women shortlist or another sort of quota-based system, if it meant they were going to get to be elected, because that's such a privilege and it's what they want. And I just think that then the systemic effect of having that more diverse parliament in place, and that those more diverse people setting the rules is could be such a benefit to the whole system, that it's worth those individuals having to come in through that suboptimal route in terms of their personal sort of brand to achieve that change within the institution. But then I would think that, because I've never stood for election and that's not my my point of view. But so I take the kind of good of the whole institution view, but that's my perspective.
Thank you, Hannah. Did you want to say anything, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest that the question shouldn't be whether we want them or like them, but whether they address the problem. And in a situation where women and other groups are underrepresented, and where we know that the playing field isn't level, what we do know from the global evidence, it's not just the Labour Party, it's the global evidence, is that good quotas with sanctions that are designed well to fit their electoral system deliver. And if you want a parity parliament, then you're going to have to intervene, because it's very unlikely to happen naturally anytime soon. So for me, it's about evidence-based policy making. We have a problem, we need a solution, and quotas are the solution that works. So whether you or I like it doesn't really matter. It resolves the problem. And I think I would quite query this idea that it renders those people who've gone through it vulnerable. Post 1997, when the numbers of Labour women, numbers of MPs doubled overnight, people didn't know which women were actually on the all-women shortlist. They talked a lot about what was wrong with quota women, but most of the time they didn't know which of those new MPs were the 35 that were on the endorsed Labour women's shortlist. So it's the context within which we accept arguments that say, well, if women have been on a quota, they must be rubbish, as opposed to saying, well, actually, look at who we've got at the moment. Do we really think this is a good enough quality? So I think we need to shift the terms of that debate, because we end up blaming women for making use of a mechanism that resolves the obstacles and the discrimination they face.
Thank you, Sarah. We've got a question from John Davies, which I think one answer, if depending on how you feel about them, might be quotas. But what are the other answers? He said, what are the examples of trends from other countries and parliaments where they have been able to make a change? And could these be used to kind of encourage, shame the UK Parliament leadership into action? So quotas, I think, you know, they certainly work. You may not like them, but what are the other solutions that we've seen elsewhere? Anyone want suggestions?
I mean, I'm happy to answer this. I would never just advocate for quotas. I don't think quotas solve all of the problems that explain away women's inability to access equally political spaces. So a quota plus strategy, we have to look at, and this goes back to the work of Johnny Lewandowski, the supply and the demand side. We need to ensure that political parties are opening the gates to women's recruitment and not closing it down. So we do need to ensure that the kind of resources that make it possible to participate in politics are available to women. And there is a risk here that people say, well, women don't have enough of X, Y, and Z. Some of that is actually about changing how Parliament itself works, going back to the first question. Because if Parliament wasn't like it was, more people might think, oh, I can work there, I have those skills, I don't have to give up everything else in my life, I can actually be a parent, I can do some caring. So some of the problem, we shouldn't take politics as if it has to be as it is today, and how do we fit women and other people into that institution? We need to start from a different perspective. which is what is it that our politics should be like, and construct it so that other people think, yeah, I have those skills, I have the motivation, and that institution is going to support me in my work. So it's not very practical to answer the question, but I think it's a different way of conceiving of the problem. And I think that really makes a difference to how parties should then behave. For example, if the good political candidate is the person who has spent the last 5 years delivering leaflets 5 nights a week and every Saturday morning, and you're somebody who's got children and an aging parent, you're not going to look like a very good candidate. Why is it that we think that's somebody who's a good local party activist? We have to change how we judge the qualities that our candidates should have.
Sarah, I'm going to put in the next question. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Sonia and Hannah, because I think they relate back to John's question. There's a question from Ingfield Paulson about drinking in politics has been getting a lot of attention. And this is something I've been thinking about because many of you, I'm sure you'll be aware that there's been real parallels in the Australian Parliament and the awful case of Brittany Higgins, who is actually a fellow at our sister institute at the Australian National University. And one of the things that's come out of the review in Australian politics is the questions about whether there should be alcohol available in Parliament. And I'm a little bit torn because I think lots of workplaces involve after work drinks, after work socializing, late nights. That doesn't mean it's okay to abuse your power. But on the other hand, you know much more about Westminster than me. What do you think, Sonia?
I mean, it's a really, really good question. And I think we were having the conversation a few months ago about drinking culture in Downing Street and what the issues were there. But I think part of the reason that this culture exists is because Westminster and Downing Street or certain departments feel like a real safe space for people to let go because they're surrounded by colleagues or peers who generally sort of think like them. It doesn't tend to be an area where there's loads and loads of tourists or people from certain parts of the world. And there's a bit of an unwritten rule sometimes that what happens on the estate stays on the estate. So I guess, how do you dismantle that? Is it just actually having greater transparency, allowing more people onto the estate, encouraging more people into these spaces so that they don't feel like a safe space for bad behavior only? But I think that's going to be a real challenge to work on. But I think there's the bad behavior comes from the comfortableness of feeling safe that you're surrounded by people who think and act in the same way that you do, and therefore any bad behavior won't be kind of highlighted, I guess.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Sonia. Hannah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, again, reflecting on my own personal experience, it's not just about drinking culture and things being a sort of facilitator for bad behavior. It's more also about the exclusionary effect of people only being able to get on in their careers if that is something they are able to participate in a positive sense. And so, as a parent of 3 small children, I often regret the fact that I can't join after work drinks. And I didn't have children when I worked in the House of Commons, and that was something I sometimes chose to do. But I think that for people who have caring responsibilities, for example, if participating in that stuff is necessary to get on in your career, that makes it quite exclusionary. The other slightly facetious point, which was made to me the other day, and I think it's quite amusing, is that the Local Government Act 1972 provides that parish councils are not allowed to meet in places with an alcohol licence. So there's a good example of Parliament telling other people to behave in certain ways that they do not apply to themselves.
Parish councils can still act badly though, Hannah. We've seen some very funny examples, even without the alcohol.
Indeed. Jackie Weaver.
Well, hopefully I've still got authority here. We'll see how we get on. Sarah, have you got any thoughts about that? You've done a lot of research about how you make parliaments more gender sensitive.
I think I go back to a first principle, which is, what is it about the institution that requires the capacity to have alcohol at the times and in the amounts that perhaps it does? And I think this is about perhaps a critique of the idea of the total institution and I think that's what Sonia was sort of alluding to, this idea that you're there and it's at Westminster Village and you all go up there. And, you know, do we really need to have drinks at an 11 o'clock reception in Parliament? I think I'm trying to think about the earliest time I was offered a gin and tonic by a member of the House of Lords. I think it was 10 o'clock in the morning. So I think there are some questions about need. And perhaps we need to have greater regulation of alcohol. But I am minded by your opening point, was that there is a risk that we take away agency and the responsibility from bad behaviour and we put it onto alcohol as opposed to the actual institution. And I thought Sonia's point about the kind of what goes on tour stays on tour is precisely everything that needs to be dismantled about Parliament, right? That's the kind of attitude that supports the transgression of appropriate behaviour. So I would be much more careful about the provision of alcohol, but I would also, again, make sure that it doesn't reintroduce ideas of MPs being special and staff not being special, because I think there has been in the past, sometimes at least, an idea that it's the alcohol amongst staff that causes some of the problem, and MPs are exceptions and need to have a good glass of wine to relax. So I'd be a bit concerned. But I do think it raises the bigger questions about why are MPs and staff wanting to be on the estate late at night drinking, or even in the middle of the afternoon drinking. I think that's what needs to be questioned.
I just wanted to jump in on Sarah's point as an observation, but I thought it was really interesting that there's been a recent case of, I can't remember which political party it was, but an MP who had a few drinks and got a bit handsy with his staff, and he totally blamed the alcohol. So the narrative that was emerging was just to remove any personal agency from that situation. So yeah, you're totally right, and really interesting to see how prevalent that sort of approach is now.
I'm really interested in all of your thoughts, and I think it's not that I think getting really drunk at work is a good idea. I think it's just in a lot of other workplaces, you'll think, I'm at the work event, I'll have one drink and I'll stop there because it's my responsibility to control my behaviour. And this idea that there's a sort of inevitability, or people are working late, people are drinking, therefore these things will happen. Sonia, I think you're exactly spot on with my difficulty with it. We've only got space for probably one or two more questions, but I think there are a couple here it'd be really nice to get through. One of them is, it's difficult for women from working class backgrounds to get involved. How are we going to support women from working class backgrounds to get into office? Thoughts?
I'm happy to have a go. I mean, I actually think that we need to be moving to a situation where those people who require, well, if we think about the cost of participating in Parliament, so I'll try and get my COVID brain to work a bit better. The cost of politics, we know, is a barrier. It seems to me that we should be moving over time to the ability for people to have paid leave from their work to participate as a candidate. I think we need to really radically change the ability of people for whom cost is a barrier. And I don't see any reason why, when we think about many organisations support people doing voluntary work. We have other provisions from the state to support other kinds of activities. If we take political participation seriously and we think it's an indicator of political equality, then we need to provide the means for people, not just the people who are able to take 6 months off from their own company to participate and stand as a candidate. Why can't everybody have that minimal right to some kind of income so they can participate in politics?
Sonia, do you have any thoughts?
No, I agree. I think the biggest access for a lot of people from working class backgrounds is finances, which is why I think paying people for internships and apprenticeships and making sure that they can access them is really important. I think the one thing I would love to see in an ideal system is kind of dismantling these secret routes of access, and just to have far more transparency in terms of the processes by which people get jobs or get work experience or others in Parliament, because it can often very much be like friends of friends of friends and go out further. So I think finances would always be number one, but I think transparency around routes of access and maybe formalizing those processes a lot more would be my secondary answer.
Thank you. I've got a question here that I think, Hannah, you might be a good one to answer. Johnny Lavandusky's asked, can Parliament learn? More specifically, what are the processes whereby learning takes place? So she's asking about what are the ways that we can initiate and sustain this change that we all want to see. What do you think, Hannah?
I think this is really tricky, and it applies to all parliaments, and not just in relation to the issues we've been discussing today, that you know, a parliament at any given time is a set of people, and those people turn over and change. And when you work in parliament, which I did for 10 years, you see different cohorts come in, and they are different, and they have different expectations. They come out of a different set of workplaces, and they bring different dynamics into parliament. The institutional kind of memory of parliament, you know, such as it is, I guess, sits with staff of the House of Commons, staff of the House of Lords, who do actually often tend to remain in common. I mean, less so today than when I started my career in 2004, but you know, they do tend to stay around a long time. But the trouble with relying on staff as institutional memory and as a sort of ability to learn is that they have this deferential attitude towards members. So one of the things, for example, I've been thinking a lot about is the role of sort of deliberative techniques, and how Parliament can make more use of things like citizens' assemblies and other mechanisms to enhance its role. And the difficulty, you know, Parliament has experimented with that a little bit. We had the Climate Assembly, but there's very much an attitude from staff that, and you know, unless there's demand from members to do more of this stuff, then it's not for staff to develop the capacity within Parliament to do more of this stuff. And so it's very chicken and egg. And because the staff don't want to initiate change without it being validated by members, and don't see that as their role, they don't, you know, there's no kind of horizon scanning, blue skies coming up with ideas on the staff side, which might feed useful and interesting ideas into members, because that would be seen as dangerous as staff leading the agenda, and that would be seen as inappropriate. So I don't think we have that lesson learning unless it's initiated by members. And unfortunately, you know, for good reasons, most members are future focused and not thinking about, you know, what went well or different, you know, could have been done differently in the past. So it doesn't get initiated by members. Staff don't think it's for them. And there's no single point of leadership within Parliament, which is a whole other issue, to drive any sorts of sort of learning processes.
Thank you. We've got loads of other questions that I haven't got to that I would love to have been able to cover, that I think in some ways we've addressed. There's certainly questions about ethnicity that we've discussed a little bit at the beginning, and there's questions about working hours and whether they particularly exclude women. Sorry to have missed those. We've had such great engagement from the audience. Thank you. I suppose my sort of reflections wrapping up are, it is very, very depressing that we're having this conversation again, but it is a window of opportunity. And I'm really glad to see Hannah and Sarah tackling this from the outside to put pressure on Parliament to change. And what I really want to see is Sonia, being an elected MP, making that change that they suggest happen in the future. So thank you, the three of you, for giving us your expertise and your experience to bear on this issue. And please keep up the good work, because we really need to make the change happen much more quickly. Thank you all. And thank you to everyone for joining today. Take care.
Thanks, Rosie.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.